Kia ora, everybody. Today we'll be going over tips that came out of our user group meeting that we ran last month. So every year we do an annual user group meeting, and this year we had a range of presentations from different client sites. During those presentations, I made notes of interesting features that they'd made use of within Vernon CMS, and I'll be showing you a collection of those tips today. Two of the presentations talked about the activities module in Vernon. That's the module where you can track in detail specific processes that happen in the management of objects in your collection, including inward loans and exhibitions. Within inward loans, you can make use of the word merge reporting tool to generate loan agreements. Word merge is a type of report in Vernon which you can use in any of the different files, but it's particularly applicable to activities where you're often generating legal documents. So here I've got a loan which I've already prepared, and I might want to reprint a loan agreement that I've made for that. So I can go to the reporting screen up on the top right, and I can choose the report that I'm wanting to run. I've already run that one earlier today, so it's marking that as one of the recent reports. And I can choose whether I'm running that to the screen or the printer. In my case, Microsoft Word isn't open, so it will automatically open for us, and it opens the template, which controls the layout of the content, and then merges that together with the data that you've got in Vernon CMS, and we end up with this finished result. What I'll do quickly is just show you how that template is set up behind the scenes. So if I go back a step on the report and say that I want to edit the report template, it's through the formatting options that we've linked a Word document already that controls how we want to lay out the presentation of this information. So this particular report is linked to the folders, reports, and a template which I've called inward loan form. I could choose at this point to modify that layout document, in which case it will open the layout in Word, and I could modify that further. So let's run that report again with the modify layout document option set. It'll open up Word for us, but we'll first see the template with some instructions about how we get from here to the finished result, since we'll now have to do one manual step to achieve that. We can see that this report includes a number of generic formatting features available in Word, so we can make use of tables and borders, we can embed things like logos, and we can also include static information, so text that is going to remain the same every time that you run that report. Everywhere where you see these double angle bracket fields, that's a placeholder for a field of information that's coming from the relative record back in Vernon. So in this case, we can see the loan file number, the type of loan, the lender, and so on. But if I scroll down the page, we can also see that I've got paragraphs of information of standard conditions that are part of our loan legal document. So we can include those in the template, and they'll be automatically generated as part of running that report. I can click on Finish and Merge. In this case, I've got no images, so there's no extra steps to make sure that Vernon picks up the images. So I can just click on the generic Finish and Merge button in Word, and I'll get that same result that I saw a second ago. So it's combining those two things, the layout and then the data that's coming from Vernon. If you've got reports for activity files that you're running often, you can set those up as what we call standard reports. And then there's a shortcut on the menu to get to those. So if I go back to the very first page, we can see these different tabs, one of which is the standard tab, and there's a setup button here, which is where we can connect different reports that we run often and make them available as a standard option for users in different files. So let's see which ones I've got set up in the demo system. On the left are the titles of the reports that I've created that I want to be available as standard reports. And then on the right is where in the system we're connecting them to. So we can see the loan schedule that we had, and that's been connected into the inward loan as part of the object table. So we saw on the example word merge that I did before that the objects were just listed as a simple text listing. We could actually print them as their own object report, and then we would have a lot more control over the formatting of each object within that schedule. And so this row is actually connecting to an example schedule where the objects are done as a separate report. And so because that's a standard report, I have that available just directly on the report menu through the quick reports option. It'll warn me if I've got multiple records saying, do I want to run this report on all of the different loans? I've only got one loan, and then it'll say which are the standard reports that I've got available. So I might be wanting to run that loan schedule. It knows that that's connected to the object table within the loan, and it says, oh, well, these are the objects that are available for this specific loan. Do you want to include all of those in the report? Which I do. And then like we'd had before, it will now automatically open up Word, in this case with a template that's specific to that schedule. But because that's a report specifically on the object file, we have a lot more control over how we're going to break down the individual fields of information for each object catalog record. That's as opposed to doing that straight from the loan agreement, where we've just got a simple table listing the summary of each object and we can't drill down further. So often that would be the case with things like loans. You might have a general agreement and then an attached schedule, which are done as two separate reports, and then you've got full control at both of those levels. Another one of the topics that came up in those initial presentations was the renewal of loans. There's two different ways you could manage that within Vernon. On the most basic level, you could just simply update the loan dates if a loan has been extended. However, many sites like to actually create that as a new loan agreement. So they generate a new legal document with a new start and end date. And it's possible that some of the other loan details might also change at the same time. Maybe not all of the objects are going to be carried over into this longer term loan, or some of the conditions are changing in some way. So I can mark that a particular loan is approved, and that means that somebody's checked this loan and decided that this loan can be copied to a new loan agreement based on these details. So I'll save that record. Any loans which have been approved for renewal, you can now create the renewed loan agreement and renewed loan record through the Tools menu. I first have to open up the loan that I'm wanting to renew, so I can go back to that loan that we looked at a second ago. So loan number 1 has had the renewal approved. And now if I go to Inward Loan Renew, it will create an entirely new record with a status of renewed loan. And at that point, we could edit these details, including the dates, without affecting the original loan record, which is now closed off. So we're renewing starting from this date, and it's going to run until partway through next year. And so now I've got two loan agreements which I can maintain independently from each other. One other point that came up in the discussion was how would you manage exhibitions where you've got different categories of records within the whole exhibition and you want to organize those in some way. We can do that through user-defined fields, and I'll show an example of that through an exhibition venue record. I'll bring up exhibition venue number 1 where I've already entered some information. So this exhibition of Crownland pottery items has 11 different objects that are involved in it, but these objects might be in different sections of the exhibition, and we might want to permanently record those exhibition sections. We could create a user-defined field specifically for those categories. If I go to the Objects and Activities page, I've already set that up. I'll just stretch that window larger so that we can see that. So I've created a new column in here, which I've called Exhibition Area. That's an authority controlled field, so it's up to me to create whatever terms are relevant. So I've created several different ones that cover the themes that were part of that exhibition: Crownland Origins, the war years, peak production, and then line by line, I can mark each object which is the appropriate category. So those spare fields are available in any activity file, and there's user-defined fields that are aligned both with the objects and ones that are just generic for the whole activity. So the generic ones that would apply to the whole activity are available through user-defined fields on the left here. I don't have any defined yet for this particular one, but if you had some generic terms that you're wanting to assign that didn't naturally fit into any of the fields that are available, this is where you could add more of those user-defined fields. So the creation of those is something that only the supervisors can do, but I'll just go into the part of the system where that's set up. We can go into user-defined parameters and user-defined fields configuration. And when you go to options, you'll see that for every activity file, there's two different sets of user-defined fields. There's one for the whole file. So that was that generic page we saw about the whole exhibition venue. And then there's a second category of exhibition venue, the object associated multi-values table. So that's how we're creating extra columns that are directly in their objects table just for exhibition venues. And that's where my exhibition area column was created. So if I go to that, we can see I've used one of the user-defined authority fields and I've just called it exhibition area. And then there's other spare fields for numbers, for dates, for text fields. Another one of the topics that was briefly touched on during those talks was managing data in the person file, and that was particularly the case for Australian Racing Museum. So they're managing detailed biographies about jockeys, photographers, equipment manufacturers, and about the horses that are connected to the collection. In a slightly unusual example of using the person file, they're cataloguing the horses in the person database so that they can make use of all of the biographical information that's available in the person file. So here's an example of a New Zealand performer, Howard Morrison. For each individual, you could record multiple different names. We know in this case, Howard's middle name, for example. You might have basic biographical details. We've expanded the ethnicity table. So in this case, we know that Howard Morrison was from Te Arawa descent and from Irish descent. We might connect those people records to other records that exist in the system. So he was part of a performance group, which was called the Howard Morrison Quartet, and that also exists as a record in the person database. And then I've linked those two records together, also specifying the range of dates where that relationship was true. Lastly, on the biography tab, if we wish to, we could create much more detailed histories about anything that Howard Morrison had been connected with places, with events, with dates, different roles that he'd played. In the case of Auckland Museum, they're using this biography table as what they call a service sheet for military service personnel, and that becomes a detailed history of that person's involvement in the military. So the voyages they undertook, the military units they were part of, the individual battles and events they took part in. If I switch to the Auckland Museum site, we can see an example of a person record created in Vernon and then published to their website. So this data is coming directly from the Vernon person record. We can see some of that information like the birth and death dates, the service numbers they're recording in the names table using a specific name type of service number. They've got some user-defined fields like military ranks is something that isn't in the system by default, and they've created a user-defined field for that. And then a lot of the further information is coming from that biography table with various different biographical types. So they've got biographical types for various civilian connections, for different service roles they've had, and all of that's coming from that table and then being formatted for the public on their online collection website. We could also see at the top of the page that we can link media material to this, like images and video and sound files. In the Australian racing example, this is an example of a person record where they've described the details about one horse that's connected to the collection. Again, they've captured an image of that horse, and then the details of things like date of birth, date of death, biography are coming directly from that biography table that we saw before. They've also made use of those user-defined fields so they can capture some really unique information, including things like the wins that that particular horse had at various different racing events. So that's some quick examples of how extensive the person information can be if you want to capture that detail. The next talks we had particularly looked at data importing. So I'll look at how XML Import is used within the system to do bulk imports of data and give you some tips about other types of data cleanup that we can do. Firstly, you can take data out of Vernon CMS to help assist with data cleanup completely independently of the system. You might, for instance, want to copy out basic person information because you're wanting to compare that to a spreadsheet of people that you have outside of Vernon, and you want to look for where the overlaps are, checking which people records maybe need to be created in Vernon before you can carry on. We could do a search on what records we're wanting to look at. My demo system isn't large, so I'll just choose all of the records. And I can use List Manager as a very quick way of bringing out basic information in a list form from Vernon to Excel. I'll click on the List button, and then I'll change the columns to the ones that I need to have access to outside of Vernon. The View Change Fields button is used to do that. And I can go and pick the fields that I'm interested in. So I might want to see the ID of the record, and then maybe the name of the person in a specific format. I could then take that data, and there's an easy option to copy that to Excel, either with or without the images. And then I would have that data outside of the system. There's then tools you can make use of in Excel to manipulate that information and to compare other columns with this detail to see whether there's any overlap. I've set up an Excel spreadsheet in advance to show different examples of that. So this is a set of person information which I've already copied out of that demo system and put into one tab of this particular spreadsheet. On the first page, I've got a list of new artists which I want to add to the system, but I'm concerned that maybe some of those already exist in the system and I don't want to duplicate that information. So let's go to tab 1, and we can see the artist that I want to add is this set of 5 people. We can use Excel to automatically look up those names in a set of other columns that are in the same spreadsheet. And so I've done that with an Excel XLOOKUP formula. And this looks fairly complex, but there's simple tutorials to say how you construct these formulas. Breaking it down, I'm saying to look at cell A2, which is the name of the person on that row, so Mike Austin, and then look at that person in a particular sheet. So I've got a sheet which I'll call person records, and then look for the data in a particular part of a column. So I'm looking in column 2 from row 2 to 23. And then based on that, I'm going to return the information that's in the aligned column, column A. So if we go back to that second one, we can look down there and we can see Mike Austin is actually a person record already in Vernon. This is the data that we've exported out of Vernon, and we can see that Mike Austin is already in there with system ID 145. And so this formula would be scanning in column B2 to B23. It would find that particular entry, and then it's going to return the ID that's in column A. And so we can see that it's done that. It's found a matching record, number 145. All the ones where it says not applicable are the ones where it couldn't find a match, and they're ones where we might have to import those as new records in Vernon at a later stage. If we were going to have to import some of these records, then we might manipulate that information first in Excel. Firstly, we can see that their names are in a single cell, whereas back in Vernon, the person names are split into first name, known as, and last name. There are simple functions in Excel to split the data in a column based on standard pieces of punctuation. So in this case, we could just split the data in that column based on the space character. And to do that, it's just a case of selecting the column we want to split. And then in the data tab at the top, we can use the text to columns function to split that data. And it'll just say, how is the data separated or delimited? And I'll say in this case, it's actually split using a space character. And then we can click on next to finish that. And so it's taken that data and split it cleanly into two columns. Of course, there might be some manual review. If you had some people with middle names, but not consistently, you might have to scan through that and manually move around things so that you've consistently got a column for first name and consistently one for surname, but this will certainly speed up the process. Another example cleanup tool that you could use in Excel would be converting uppercase data into propercase. Again, there's formulas for doing that. So if I had raw data that was outside of Vernon where all of the surnames were in uppercase, that may not be how I want it in Vernon. And ideally, you don't want them in uppercase because it's easy to convert to uppercase, but it's actually difficult going back the reverse. So normally that would be purely a style convention where you might have that on a website, but you ideally want the source data to always be in proper case. And so I've converted that in the next column, just using another simple formula. So there's already a built-in formula for converting uppercase into proper case. We just have to say equals proper and then the name of the cell. You can also copy a formula between cells just by dragging the small box that's in the corner of the cell. So copying that will copy the formula and it will correctly update the cell that's being referenced in each one. So if I looked on the second one, we'll see that's going to A3, A4. So me copying that formula, Excel's automatically taking care of adjusting that formula to be correct for each of the rows. So those are some simple examples where we might clean up the data and compare the data in Excel. We can then bulk import information into Vernon using XML Import. Again, I've got an example which I've already set up, using an example of snow globes where I've created basic catalog records in Excel. And so this is the data that I'm wanting to import. So I've got a number of pieces of basic information that will be part of the catalog record in Vernon, its succession number, classification, maker, and so on. Vernon can't import directly from Excel. Excel doesn't structure the data that well. And so there's an intermediate step where we have to convert this data into XML format. So XML is an international standard for creating structured data where every individual field is clearly described in the file so that the destination system knows what each piece of information relates to. And so what we can do is take that data and using the generic XML import spreadsheet that's supplied with Vernon, we can then generate an XML file of that data. So I've already generated that data already. So I can now go into Vernon CMS and import those as new records into the system. So I'll go to the Tools menu and I'll use XML Import. XML imports require some basic information to say where is each column of information going to end up when you import it into Vernon. So a field level matching to say column by column, this is the appropriate field in the appropriate file in Vernon. I've already done that work for my snow globe, so let's pick that particular configuration record. But I will briefly go into that just so that we can see how that's set up. So I'll go to that highlighted configuration. And so that's set up to say it's going to go into the object file. So they're going to be new object catalog records. We're going to assign them a status of accessioned. We're saying where is the XML file that's going to be the basis for this import. So that's what we saw back in Excel a second ago. And then on the second tab is where we have the field level mapping. So we saw accession NO as a column, and that's going to the accession _ NO field in Vernon. And of course, there's options on those columns to help you pick the right field, and you can see the field labels at that point. And then there's also an option to automatically look in the XML file and just find all of the different columns that are mentioned in there. And that gives you a quick starting point where it lists all of these elements, and then you just have to pick the appropriate field. We can also say whether we're trying to import data into records that already exist in Vernon, or whether we're creating brand new records. And in this case, I'm creating brand new records in the system. So at that point, I'm ready to run my import. And so now let's run that. And so now it's working its way through the 8 different catalog records that were in that Excel spreadsheet. And it's finished importing all of those. So those XML import configurations can be quite complex. You can export the configuration itself out to Excel if you're wanting to review that in an interface where you can more easily resize columns and so on, or possibly export it to Excel because you want to send it to us for review. And so you can do that from the XML import configuration screen. And I'll open up that same snow globe one since we've already had a look at that one. And so in the field mapping page, that's where you can copy it outside of Vernon. And we can do that just with the generic edit, copy to Excel option. So that's something you can do in any table in Vernon for any purpose. And so it's useful in this case because there's some complex information there which might be useful in some cases to get outside of the system. So let's open that up in Excel, and we've got that now as a form that we could save as a spreadsheet and email back to Vernon Systems, for example. That XML import configuration screen also has a description field that's unlimited in its length. So we recommend using it for describing the general purpose of this particular import if it's something you're going to be doing repeatedly, and possibly even noting particular import runs that you've done of this. So you might note particular dates when you've imported another set of records using that configuration. So that's good just for history of how this data got into the system and for people in the future to understand what each of these different configurations was intended for. Another thing to always keep in mind is the idea of perfect being the enemy of good. Cataloging is always going to be an ongoing process. There's always going to be improvements of data standards. There's always going to be other areas of research you can do about your objects and the people and organizations and places that are connected to your collection. And there's really not going to ever be an end to that process. There's always more things you could do in terms of improving the digital files that are linked to the records, the research that's been done to check information. And so it's better to have the information in Vernon in the state it currently is, rather than endlessly try to revise it outside of the system. Because once it's in Vernon, you've then got all of those other tools for searching and reporting and data checking that you wouldn't have outside of the system. There were some other data cleanup tools that were mentioned in both of those talks. There was directory list and print, which I've got a screenshot here. So that's a third-party product which can be pointed to a particular folder on the network and can pull out all kinds of information. It can, for instance, highlight files that are duplicated in different folders across a particular directory structure. And it can automatically pull out metadata that's embedded in those files. So, for instance, you might be creating catalog records for things that you only have images of, but the images might already have titles, captions, and descriptions embedded in the image files. So tools like directory list and print can pull out that metadata into a form where you can manipulate it in Excel and then bulk import it into Vernon CMS. ChatGPT can also be used to generate things like ideas. So I'll just type in a question. I'll say, what are common themes for museum exhibitions? And so ChatGPT has an enormous volume of content from all different websites around the world, and it's able to quickly find answers based on that content. It's not necessarily 100% correct, but it's a great way of gathering starting points for particular ideas. And then lastly, another cleanup tool that's available are system monitor commands within Vernon. So Vernon CMS has a command line interface, which we call system monitor, and there's various commands that we can get you to run on there to do things like bulk deletions of records, bulk clearing of a specific field on a group of records where the data's bad. And then the last talks that we had in the user group meeting were looking at server hosting, which is a service that we provide, and also many of our clients have their servers hosted through external IT providers. And we looked at the topic file within Vernon and how that can be used. For server hosting, we're using Microsoft's cloud service. So that's called Azure, and it's a series of different data centers in different parts of the world. There's physical hardware there, and you're essentially renting hardware to run different services there. When we host Vernon CMS for clients, we're setting up a server and a desktop, and then you're connecting remotely to that infrastructure that we've set up for you and that we maintain on your behalf. So you get on with cataloging Vernon, copying assets up to there, and we take care of managing the infrastructure and the backups. And so a typical process would be that we've got a virtual machine, a machine that's running the Vernon CMS software that's connected to data disks, which is storing the software itself and all of the assets that you're creating. So the Vernon CMS database with the catalog records and all of the media and document files you're attaching to that. And then you're connecting that to an external public location. So you're using Microsoft Remote Desktop to then view a desktop on that virtual machine in the cloud. Topic records are for any more complex content that might connect to different parts of the collection. So in this example, I've got a wall label. That wall label might have been part of an exhibition, and it might have described a whole group of objects that are part of that corner of the gallery for that specific exhibition. Each individual topic has a title, an optional summary, and then a detailed description. You can then connect that topic to other places in the system. So that would typically include objects that are related to that particular theme or label, but it might also be other things like subject and associations with people, with places, with events. So this particular topic has been marked as being in the category of natural sciences, and it's related specifically to the region of Australia. The second topic record that I have is one where I've noted that it's still in progress. So there's a status field where you can say how far that content writing has gone. So in this case, it's ready for review by another staff member. And in this case, it relates to a collection level description. So a very broad description about a whole collection that we maintain within Vernon CMS. We can then look online and see examples of those topic records being used by a couple of different client sites. So firstly, there's the Queensland Museum example. And so this is a topic record they have about garden butterflies. Those topic records can link to photo, audio, visual records. So we have an image for this particular topic. And then we can see the description field. The description field can include formatting using the International Markdown Standard. So that's a simple punctuation-based formatting standard where within Vernon Browser, we then interpret those punctuation marks and apply the appropriate formatting, which might be headings, bold, italic, links, bullet points, etc. We can connect to other related topics. So in this case, this is a very broad category, and then there's more specific topics about individual species of garden butterflies. So I could then drill down into one of those and read another topic. Another example of topics in use are at MOTAT, the Museum of Transport and Technology in Auckland. We can see the same basic layout. We've got one or more images that represents that particular topic or article. And we can see the same formatting being used, so a mixture of standard normal font with italic, bold, bullet points, embedded links. So those are all examples of formatting types that are handled by the Markdown standard. And then at the bottom of the page, this is linking to one specific related object. So they actually have an iron lung machine within their collection, and I could jump to that related object. I'll also show how the Markdown standard works. So there's just a simple free web-based editor. And on the left-hand side, we have the text we're editing, and on the right-hand side, we have an example of that being formatted. We have some further control over that in Vernon Browser, because Vernon Browser has its own client-specific themes, so we can apply different font styles for each individual client. But we can see some basic examples. So I've got a heading category, I've used italics, I've got an example of a link. So the text crown lin is going to link to that particular third-party website. And then on the right-hand side, we can see how that's formatted. So I could now click on that link to go to the related content. And so within the topic record, you can use Markdown. And so to do that, you would be editing the content within this free Markdown editor, and then you would simply copy and paste the punctuation and text into the description field in Vernon. So in Vernon, you will see that punctuation, so it's not an entirely clean way to manage that, but it means you can support a whole range of different formatting that wouldn't normally be available directly within Vernon CMS.